Okay, so are you ready, Carly?
Yes.
I want you to do the intro song this week.
Oh no, I don't do singing stuff, and I know it's not. Are we live? Welcome to the show. I thought you were gonna say, "Are you ready? Go." You tricked
Well,
me.
that's totally fine. SPSM has started. We are live. Thank you for that attempt, Carly. You're no Hudson, but God damn it, you're amazing in your own ways, and you're very, very integral to the success of this show. So thank you so much, Carly Larson.
Why, thank you.
Enough about that. Welcome to Taking Back Control of Our Stories. That is the topic for this week. SPSM Chat, Suicide Prevention, Social Media. I'm your host, Rudy Caceres, at Rudy Caceres on Twitter. That's what it says right there, but enough about me. We're talking with Nylah Burton, who is going to talk about all the cool things that she's doing, but we're also going to talk about why people with lived experience, like the people on this show, and probably a lot of you watching out there in social media land, should be at the forefront of all social media efforts, campaigns, organizations, you name it. Without further ado, if you're watching this live, please let us know that you're here. Let us know that you care by using that hashtag SPSM, especially if you're on the Twitter. Make sure you join our chat, respond to all the questions. You can totally go in and out of order. We'll have those coming up very shortly. If you're on Facebook, facebook.com/SPSMchat, or youtube.com/SPSMchat, or if you're watching this later on the day, later on the week, later on in the year, if that's still a thing, thank you. Join the conversation, leave your comments, and hang out with us for the next hour. Let's go on to our round semi-rectangle. It's just three of us today, but we're going to make it work. First and foremost, actually that would be Nylah, but second and second most, or first and sec, I don't know, just introduce yourself, Carly.
The people. All right. I am Carly, pronoun she, her, hers. I am a neurodivergent peer support program manager who is working to expand and professionalize the peer workforce here in Colorado, maybe one day eventually the world. I am a cat mom who is now a new albino gecko mom. So that's been really exciting.
Anything else going on in the Carly brand?
I watched a lot of Wes Craven movies today in celebration of his birthday. But besides that, nah.
Okay. Before we get to Nylah, I just want to give a shout out to Hudson Harris and Joelle Marie, who are texting each other back and forth as we're doing this. So they're obviously having more fun than we are. But that's going to change, Carly. You know why?
Because Nyla's here.
It's time to bring on the heavy hitter, the guest of honor. Tell the whole world, the whole SPSM chat universe, galaxy, Nylaverse, who is Nylah Burton.
All right. Well, I am a writer. Hi, everyone. I'm a writer. I write about mental health, climate, race, lots of other stuff, politics too. And I am neurodivergent and I have bipolar disorder. Um, and I also, I guess, like in terms of like hobbies, I really like crafting. I just made a flower crown by myself. I'm really, really proud of it. I almost cut off my nipple with the wire cutter, but it was fine in the end. So I really like crafting. I really like obviously reading. And I like rewatching my favorite TV shows over and over again. So I think I'm on like my sixth watch of Grey's Anatomy. So
Now your Twitter handle is at Yum Coconut Milk. There's got to be a story there.
oh, it's a story. I don't know if it's appropriate. Um,
I mean, this is the second to last show, so go for it.
okay, fine. So I was just in New York with one of my friends, and she was like talking about this sexual experience she had where this guy had like, you know, wanted her to swallow, I guess. And she was like, she was like, it tastes like coconut milk. And she was like, but I hate it. And then like one of our friends said, yum, coconut milk in this like super funny way that I can't recreate. And I was like, that is the most hilarious thing I've ever heard, the way that my friend said it. And then I wasn't like a writer then, so it didn't matter what my handle was. And so that was my handle. And then I became like a writer and I was like, oh shit, like I'm stuck with this. So that's why it's Yum Coconut Milk. And I feel like it's too late to change it at this point. But it was literally just us walking the streets of Brooklyn being, foolish. So.
Well, no, that's better than all stories that I ever told. So thank you for that. So, and that's cool. And like you've got like this great little like background going on, and it's like very like you're basically your picture is moving. So it feels like it's very mosaic, and it's almost postmodern. So
Yeah. Which background is that on my Twitter?
well, no, it's just like you keep pixelating in and out, but like it's you make it work. You're the only
Um,
person who can make pixelated video work on SPSM Chat, mind you.
oh, cool. I think it's because this background is like lights, so maybe it like looks more magical than it actually is. But yeah, that's cool. That's good to know.
Yes. Before we get into our first question of the evening, Carly, is there anything you want to talk to Nylah about or ask her?
No, I'm really excited to get into the concept of rage and suicide loss survivorship. So, rage.
Well, why wait? Let's get into it, and that takes us to question number one, and it is a doozy. Why is it important for people who have died by suicide to have control over their own stories? Of course, we got to take it back to Nylah Burton.
Okay, cool. So I feel like there are so many elements to this question, and I feel like the first thing I want to address goes back way before people even, die by suicide, which is that as mentally ill people, especially as severely mentally ill people, our, stories get told for us from the minute that we're diagnosed. Like a diagnosis in and of itself is kind of like a story that's told about you. Anytime you say, oh, I'm bipolar, oh, I have schizophrenia, like people start creating narratives in their heads and start deciding who you are. And I think that in terms of like, so that's a lack of autonomy over how you identify, how you see yourself. I think that we also have a lack of autonomy when we're getting treatment, right? So like I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 18. And I had like almost no autonomy in the beginning to make decisions for myself. I was involuntarily hospitalized like a bunch of times. All of those were traumatic. I remember one time after a suicide attempt, I don't want to say I felt fine, but I was like, I definitely like didn't need to be in a hospital. And I tried to communicate that to my psychiatrist. And he was like, you have to go. And I was like, I really don't want to. And I didn't know at the time that my refusal to sign the papers would lead to like force. And so he actually called the police and had the police take me away in handcuffs to the hospital. And it was the state hospital, which was a jail. It was a jail. And it was very unsafe there. Like I was like threatened with like sexual violence, right? And so I also had a psychiatrist who, had me on extremely, extremely heavy medicines that, probably worked for some people, but really weren't working for me. And, he didn't really pay attention to me. And then I think caretakers as well take away your autonomy. So like people in your home, they're like, if you're depressed, they're like, well, you have to get up, and they think that they know what's best for you. And obviously it's coming from, a lot of times it's coming from a place of they want to help you. But I think that as mentally ill people, we generally do not have autonomy. That's something that's taken away from us. So I think that when it comes to suicide, that's why it's so important for us to tell our stories, is because we have been denied historically, not just, historically as in the, forever sense of the world. but also in our lives, we've been denied that autonomy. And so I think that, you know, whether we're survivors or whether we've actually died by suicide, it's really important for us to get to tell the story, not only of our struggles and our illnesses and, what our attempts or our deaths, but also, our, also, well, like, I feel like I've lost thought, but yeah, like it's important for us to tell our own stories. And I think the reason why I said even in our deaths is I think, and this kind of goes back to rage, I feel like a lot of the things that suicide attempt survivors do to try to have control over our stories are like demonized and seen as attention seeking, like particularly suicide notes are seen as attention seeking behavior. But I think that they are a way of trying to reclaim autonomy, trying to say, this is what happened. I want people to know why this happened. I want, to tell my own story. I think asking for help and, letting people know what you're going through right now is an attempt to reclaim things that has also been demonized and sort of seen as attention-seeking behavior or controlling behavior, manipulating behavior. So for all of these reasons, it really just goes back to autonomy, the autonomy that's been taken away from us, and why it's so important to give that autonomy back to suicide. Not even give, right? Because it's a right that we have. So no one can really give it to us, but to not take it from us, not, actively take up space. I think that the other reason why it's so important for suicide attempt survivors, suicide survivors to tell their own stories is because I think that a lot of suicide loss survivors, so suicide loss survivors, meaning people who lost a loved one, I think that a lot of them have a lot of internalized ableism. Actually, it wouldn't be internalized, I guess, in some cases, unless they also had mental illness. But they have a lot of ableism, and they haven't really unpacked it or really examined it. And so I think that a lot of that ableism, even though they think that they're helping, is coming through, their advocacy. And a lot of that, ableism takes place in these cultural messages that we all internalize, which is, don't do this to your family, don't do this to your loved ones. It kind of is very blaming. I had one person tell me that they'd never forgive me if I killed myself. And it was such an unhelpful thing to say, but I don't think they knew it was unhelpful. But it was like, you're making this about you, and you're also instilling me with a lot of guilt about something which ultimately I don't have that much control over. And so I think that a lot of suicide loss survivors are coming to this space with those preconceived notions, with that, societally imposed ableism, maybe if they're mentally ill themselves, internalized ableism, and a lot of like fear and sadness and rage, which I think is something we're about to get to. So I think that's like why it's so important for us to have control over our own stories and for us to really lead these efforts, because I think that one, we have the experience. I think two, we're more likely to have examined that ableism and really confronted it. And I think that, we, because of that lived experience, we can just, make it better for other people who might be going through that. I'm sorry, I don't know if I was rambling.
No, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
I'm the rambler, okay? So you're very open publicly about your views, and I appreciate you for doing that, because I'm sure you get a lot of pushback, a lot of haters. So when you speak out about these issues, like we're talking about right now, what has been the pushback from people?
I get a lot of like various pushback that I just like don't pay attention to, but like I've been talking about Kanye West a lot recently. Like I've been getting a lot of like editors asking me to write about it. And I think one thing, consistent criticism that I've gotten is people are like, you have to talk about how he has to take his medication. He has to take his medication. why aren't you talking about how he has to take his medication? And, you know, that's a bit of pushback that I get. Not that I'm not, not that I'm against medication. I'm taking medication right now. It's saving my life. But, it's kind of like people have this idea of like, you always have to like, goes back to autonomy, right? Like you always have to control mentally ill people. You always have to tell them what's best for them. So I've heard a lot of that, like, in regards to Kanye West. I've also gotten a lot of pushback, I think, for, in terms of the mental health space. I've gotten a lot of pushback for something that I've been saying for a while, which is you don't have to love yourself before you can love other people or before other people can love you. I feel like that's such an ableist statement. And I've gotten so much pushback from it, even from like lots of other mentally ill and severely mentally ill people. I get a lot of pushback on that one. And then, just the, TW, but like, just the regular rape threats, so yeah.
What about from suicide loss survivors? Do you hear from any family members? People think that you're out to get them, basically?
I think that I've gotten a few comments that are very defensive. When I talk about a lot of this stuff, which is like, well, us particularly around inpatient hospitalization. I think that a lot of people don't like what I have to say about inpatient hospitalization because they're like, well, that saved, my son's life or my daughter's life or my partner's life. And, if I had to do it over again, I would do it. And I think that they're coming from a fundamental misunderstanding of what I'm saying. I don't think it's wrong for people to take their loved ones to the hospital because a lot of times that's the only thing available to them. What I think is wrong is that that's the only thing available to them. And so I really feel like we should, as a community, focus on community-based solutions, not, carceral solutions, because, mental hospitals are not therapeutic like people think that they are. That's another reason why suicide loss survivors should be at the forefront of this conversation, because a lot of the people who actually take you to the hospital after an attempt or during crisis have never been in a psych ward. And so they don't know where they're taking you and what they're subjecting you to. I had someone take me to the hospital who didn't know that my phone would be confiscated. And I was like, yeah, that's like psych ward 101. And it's like, it's not their fault, but it's like, people don't really know what happens in those hospitals. And so I feel like I've gotten a lot of defense about that. Like, well, I had to take them. And I'm like, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, why don't we try to use our imaginations and think about a different way to handle those situations? And I think also there are some people who don't have to go inpatient. And that's a whole other conversation historically, especially about women who, and people of color, especially people who exist on that, intersection of gender and race, who have been, hospitalized for normal reactions to, harm that was done to them. Everyone knows about Bedlam and how, the husbands would put their wives in there, when they wanted to have an affair or whatever. Or, fathers would put their daughters in there when they were, having sex or whatever. But, there are also times where Black people are put into mental hospitals simply for displaying any type of emotion or being upset. A lot of times where Black people in mental health crises have been shot and killed. So again, I feel like I'm rambling. I feel like I got off topic. But yeah, like I get a lot of pushback like that. Like I get people who are like very defensive and sort of like unwilling or unable to imagine things differently, conceive of things differently. So yeah.
Well, I know Carly is someone who can imagine things differently. What say you to question number 1?
So I think I agree with all the autonomy stuff. I agree with everything that was said. And I think it's really important because nobody can tell our stories appropriately except us. And I think this is where I get really grossed out isn't the right term, but I'm going to use it for thinking about psychological autopsies, that there's this objective, quote unquote, objective professional who comes in, scours your life, and then is all of a sudden able to write like your diary. And they're able to like explain things. And you can look at a lot of the different pieces of someone's life. And unless you've lived them, walked in their shoes, you don't know. We have found ways to communicate our experiences with other humans, but that we are still so limited by language and just being able to communicate the way that people's minds work. So I think that's a really big problem, is you just don't know someone's story unless they're telling it. I think the other issues I see are more the way stories are told by loss survivors. So it feels like a lot of things get misrepresented. So when I think about that, I think it's like there's kind of a few different camps, like they're not all the same. I think there's a really heavy focus on like the accomplishments of somebody and what their loved ones see as accomplishments and not what they see as accomplishments. Like so-and-so was an honor student at their college and they did this, without thinking that like, yeah, maybe that's when a lot of their depression started, when we're like working ourselves to death in school, and like at what cost did some of these accomplishments come? Because I think a lot of the accomplishments we experience through our lives, a lot of them are good and a lot of them are a lot of work or cause some harm in some way. So I think there's like kind of that icky thing. I need to close my blinds really quick. I think you also see this kind of idea. I think like there are a lot of people with diagnoses who die by suicide. There are a lot of people without diagnoses who die by suicide as well. And I think the way that people's stories get told, it's always with like an answer. I think there are some people who are like, we will never know, and it's a complete mystery. And I don't know if that's always fully accurate. But I think a lot of the times they're like, oh yes, once they were diagnosed with X, Y, and Z, that's when their troubles started. And then that led them to this. Versus like, I imagine if they have a diagnosis, then there was challenges before that happened, and there continue to be challenges, and probably wasn't even related to the diagnosis. It was related to the way that our world reacts to people with mental health challenges. And I think that gets really ignored, and it really puts an othering of people who die by suicide, where it's like, oh, they had a diagnosis, they did this, and like nobody can relate. Only people who die by suicide. Or I think depression is always really promoted for people who die by suicide. And I don't think depression is like the biggest killer that it kind of comes off as. So I think you kind of have this like need for an answer that's like nobody's going to know, unless even when people leave suicide notes, even when it feels like they fully explain themselves, I still think that's never known. And I don't think people do it in a way that's relatable. So it's like, if I were to tell my story, if Ghost Carly came back to the planet after dying by suicide, still super tiny sized, I imagine like what I would say is so much different than what anyone else would say about me. They would be completely incongruous. And I think it's like, if we're getting misrepresented, it misrepresents so much about ourselves. I also think if I were to come back as Ghost Carly and tell you, like, here's why I killed myself, so many people would be able to relate to it. And I think a lot of the way stories get told is to make it unrelatable, to make it just like, nope, we don't know, or it's because of this diagnosis that you don't have, so you're not going to. So it's like clouding this idea of suicide instead of being like, hey, all of us probably question our existence, if not at least once in our life, probably a lot. And like some people just take action on that and some people don't. I think I started rambling and I don't know how I was going to close that sentence.
I'm really holding back from stopping and creating a Ghost Carly graphic, but that would be inappropriate because we have great things ahead. And speaking of being ignored, our fans on Twitter are not going to be. So let's give some shout outs because I know Ashley J is bringing the fire on the Twitter, which we appreciate.
Oh, hi, Ashley.
Yes. Okay. Let's refresh this thing. Okay. So and please,
I
please,
know
please.
Ashley.
Oh, she's amazing. We had her on not too long ago as well.
I
So
mean, from Twitter.
Adriana Conley. First, let's get to that. In response to question number 2, we haven't even got to question number 2. Okay, so let's hold off on that. Okay, so Ashley J says on inpatient hospitals, I don't think going to the hospital is wrong. The only thing that's wrong is hospitalization is the only thing available. Yes. Adriana, okay, question number 1. In response to question number 1, it is important because each person deserves to be remembered for the person they were. Same for any death of a person. It is important for people to have control of their story, just like everyone should. And Ashley J, you can all see this, right, on Twitter? As a chronically suicidal person myself, it is important to have control over my story because it tends to be skewed as attention seeking or I'm not quote unquote positive enough. Also, some folks assume I can't be suicidal because I'm pretty, which is unhelpful when I need help. Thank you for using that hashtag, Ashley. And lastly, Ashley J says, like at Yum Coconut Milk said, as soon as people are given a diagnosis, the story is already being written about you. Question number 2. What are some problems with loss survivors leading suicide prevention efforts? Let's go back to Nylah Burton.
All right. So this is kind of like what I was saying about rage. And I think that a lot of suicide loss survivors have a lot of rage, a lot of anger about their loved ones who have died by suicide. And I think that not just died by suicide, but attempted as well. And I think that I understand it and I get it because that's such a scary thing to happen and you feel like you have no control. And I think that because they feel this lack of control, a lot of them do take out the rage and anger that they feel on either the suicide attempt survivor or the person who died by suicide. And I think that sometimes that rage shows up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's overt aggression, really rude comments about, what it was that the person did or, like attention seeking and all that type of stuff. Other times it's a little bit harder to recognize. I hate this show because it's terrible, but 13 Reasons Why is actually a really good example of that rage. All of these students are so angry at Hannah, the character who died by suicide, and they're making it like it was her fault, that she should have reached out, that she should have said hi at lunch. And all of these things are, attempts to have someone to blame. And in the end, their anger at her only dissipated when they were like, oh, we found the person to blame, right? But prior to that, they were so hostile to her memory, to her as a person. And I think that a lot of suicide loss survivors have that rage. I think that a lot of them suppress it. And I think that, they go out and they're like, I want to prevent this from happening to someone else. And a lot of that is that trying to control. But where that rage comes through is sort of the common things that are told to us in suicide prevention now, which is, check on a friend. I'm sorry, but like one time after, right before an attempt, I was at dinner with a friend and we were laughing our asses off. I was having a good time. And then it just hit me again, right? And so, so that's one of the things, like, oh, check on your friends and then reach out. Not only does that put the onus on the person who's feeling suicidal, but it also just, keeps perpetuating this myth that there are these small things that individual people can do to prevent suicide. another thing, like I said before, why would you ever do that to your family? Don't do that to your family. Don't hurt people around you like that. And it's like, that's just an incredible pressure. And, I'm in a really good space in my life right now, like mentally, like actually might be the best space I've ever been in my life, quite honestly. And I feel like even now, I was talking to some friends about it, and I was like, I can't promise anyone that I'm never going to die by suicide. I was like, I can't make that promise because, it's a part of my experience, suicidal ideation is something that happens to me. And I can't make that promise that that's never going to be something that I'm going to do, that's going to happen. I think that's a very hard pill for people to swallow. And so a lot of their, prevention efforts do focus on, they're filtered through anger. They're filtered through, not only, putting all the onus on the person who attempted or the person who died. You have to take care of yourself. You have to get help. You have to do this. You have to do that. You have to care about your family. You have to think of your family. Or, these very small things that they're like convinced, if I had done this, this person would still be alive. Or if I had done this, this person wouldn't have attempted, when, that's not the whole truth. And so I think that when suicide survivors actually tell our stories, they are a lot more nuanced and a lot more helpful, and actually get to the root of the issue, which is often systemic. And that makes people feel totally out of control because they don't know, how to combat these very big issues. A lot of people want to reduce it to tips. But if you're at the point where you're in a tip, checklist about like things to do when your friend's suicidal, that's the crisis point. That's not really suicide prevention. That's like emergency, right? But suicide prevention starts so much earlier, right? Like it starts with creating a better society. It starts with, free housing. It starts with free, healthcare. It starts with prison abolition, psychiatric abolition, because we know that people who are hospitalized for mental health issues are actually at an increased risk of dying by suicide after that hospitalization, which is like a lot to digest, right? So psychiatric abolition is also part of the answer. All of these very big things are more important to suicide prevention than check on a friend. You know what I mean? But like those small chunks are so much easier for people to digest. And then blaming a person is so much easier than actually giving them that grace and actually understanding like they just died, right? Because that you lose that control. But yeah, suicide prevention is not about a checklist. It's not about a thing that this person should have done, or this person should have done. It's really about the things that we need to change in society that help people stay alive. And those are very big ideas, very big things. And I think that suicide attempt survivors, we understand that in a way that suicide loss survivors often don't. So
I'll have you know, Nylah, that the fire emoji banner is reserved for the truest of the truths. So, and yes, I mean, we talk a lot about things that are big ideas, but they need to be talked about, and that's what we do on SPSM Chat, because not enough people are talking about abolishing psychiatric hospitals. I mean, like, there's people talking about abolishing prisons and other institutions, but somehow psychiatric institutions are not seen the same way, even though they discriminate similarly and take as many rights away, if not more, because you don't have like freaking constitutional rights in psychiatric institutions for some reason. So thank you for mentioning that, Nylah. And I'm glad that when you said I hate this show, that you weren't talking about this one.
Everybody's stomach dropped.
Well,
no, definitely 13 Reasons Why. Definitely 13 Reasons Why.
I'll tell you something that we don't hate, and that is Carly's response to question number 2.
Really quick before I touch on this, to kind of, I think the other thing to remember with inpatient hospitalization, I see this a lot with rehab as well, is it's sold as the only option, right? It's like the only one we can think of. It is also sold as like an easy fix, and you are going to put somebody in a hospital, put somebody in rehab, like all those same kind of ideas, and they're going to come out and like everything's going to be fine and they're going to be fixed. And that's just so inaccurate to such a horrible level. And like, as Nylah said, yes, suicide risk absolutely increases post hospitalization. So I think that's the other thing too, is not only do we only see this one option, we're told it works, and the amount of pain that comes after that from a lot of different people is just pretty profound. All right, question 2. I think my biggest beef with suicide prevention efforts are basically just death prohibition in a hat. It's 3 death prohibition people in a trench coat. So we really focus on like somebody not dying and staying alive, and don't focus, as was said, on all the upstream things. Like if we're talking about suicide prevention and we're talking about it within a crisis center or within any kind of hospitalization, that's not prevention anymore. We've missed the boat. We need to go upstream. And so I don't think that gets focused on, because then you have to talk about systems, and people don't know how to talk about systems a lot of the times. So I think there's that focus where like kind of the most important thing to a lot, not all, to a lot of loss survivors is that that person chose to die. A lot of the times they don't want to focus on the why, because they're so angry because of all these other feelings that come up. They're like, this person died and chose to die, and I'm pissed off about it, and they should have stayed alive no matter what. So I think that's a really big problem I see in a lot of that movement. I think a lot of loss survivors come from either like hurt feelings or grief. And grief is a form of hurt feelings, but I think a big part of the hurt feelings is where we see that anger come out, and where we see that like just real intense rage. Because again, this person chose to die, and that was not a choice I got to make. And that could be really hard. I don't want to minimize somebody losing somebody they love. However, I think when they're the ones given the platform, that absolutely creates a pretty heavy bias against suicide. Not in a helpful way. It's pointing fingers at the individual. You could have done more. You should have stayed alive. You made this really shitty decision that everyone's pissed off about you about. Versus like, man, how has this person failed throughout their lives? And like, when did they get to the point where they saw death as the best option? And why aren't we looking at that? I think there are a few loss survivors I've seen who have kind of talked from that framework, talking about various systems that failed their child, various ways that they sought support for their loved one and it wasn't there. And I think when we have that kind of frame, it's a lot more helpful. But we don't often get that. We get the grieving mother who is just really upset that her son decided to die by suicide, and maybe like, I think there's a lot of lack of self-awareness as well, especially when we talk about families, because families are the cause of a lot of trauma for people. And so it's like, well, they chose to die. And it's like, cool. So like, what would they say about their childhood? What would they say about your relationship before they died? Some of them will say it's really good, right? Like, I'm not saying it's only traumatized people who are doing this. But a lot of them would be like, man, that's where X, Y, and Z started. That's where my body dysmorphia started. Or I was abused and that's where I've experienced chronic pain, or like all these other issues. So I think when we have loss survivors running the show, they first and foremost put the onus on the individual who chose to die by suicide. And I don't think in a very positive way and not a very fair way. They center their feelings and emotions versus the person who chose to die by suicide, which is the one we should be talking about, I think, in most spaces. And I don't know. I think there's like really healthy storytelling when it comes to grief. I think storytelling is such a powerful processor, and I think people should engage in storytelling and sharing their experience. I think there are a lot of times I see some like people sharing their story, and it feels really icky. It feels co-opted. It feels like, and like, I'm not saying attention seeking is bad. We all seek attention, and that's fine. We need attention to be like human beings. But it feels attention seeking, and not in a way that honors the person who died, but in a, look at me, I am this poor person who got neglected by my loved one, and how dare they? And I think when we have that kind of narrative, it really just fuels the demonization of suicide. When it's like, look at who you're like, when we hear people who, when somebody says like, I want to die by suicide, it's like, think about all the loved people you would leave behind. And it's like, how dare you effing say that to me right now? Like, I don't care about them. Waking up in my own body is miserable. Hashtag abolish the flesh prison. Waking up in the crushing world is impossible so many days. And so I think like it demonizes it. It doesn't make it relatable. And it just works on a guilt and shame basis, which a lot of our systems and a lot of our treatments do. And when we're working from a shame place, like it's not conducive to personal growth. It's not conducive to communication or like finding any kind of progress on how do we make a world where people don't see taking themselves out of it as the best option.
Thank you, Carly. So before we get on to our next question, I just want to give another shout out to Ashley J, who's been our Twitter chat MVP. So she had a bit of a fangirl moment, Nylah, like when you gave her a shout out. So I think it would make her month if you just said like nice things about her right now.
Okay. I really like your profile picture. It's like really cool. Like every time you like my tweets, I'm like, oh, look at that cool profile picture. It's just like, it looks badass.
Question number 3. If you were to die by suicide, who would you trust to tell your story and why? Back to you, Nylah.
So I thought about this question and I was like, nobody. And I think that's because, one, as a writer, I feel like I'm like horrified by the concept of someone else telling my story, because I'm like, I can barely tell my story. Like I have to write a lot of drafts before I write an essay. So I don't know how you're going to do that. But I do think that a lot of different people could tell my story, like different parts of my story. So there are definitely people in my life who I know love me a lot, know me intimately, like the deepest parts of myself, you know, deepest pain, you know, all that stuff. But I feel like, you know, they also have a lot of ableism that they have not unpacked or addressed, even though there's this deep love. And so like, even though I love them and they love me, I wouldn't want them to tell my story at all. But I also feel like there are parts of my story that they could tell and tell really beautifully. I feel like there are other people in my life who have also, you know, examined ableism and have like really good things to say and like, you know, are very supportive and understand where I'm coming from, especially around a lot of my feelings about suicide. But I also feel like, you know, maybe they don't know me as well. Maybe they don't know me that well internally, right? And then there are people who, you know, really like my work and understand, you know, my identity as a writer in a way that other people wouldn't. So there are people who like understand different parts of me. And so I guess if they like all got together and like put it together and like didn't glamorize me, because I hate that also. Like I hate the whole like Jimi Hendrix, Sylvia Plath, like, you know, when suicide loss survivors get up and they say every single good thing about a person and they're like, oh, they were never mean and they were never this and they were never that. Like I hate that also. So I'd want them to be real. So I feel like if they got together and like held like a thing and then they wrote my story, I'd be happy if it was like a collab, I guess. But yeah, I guess no one. I feel like I would be the best person to do that. But if I had to choose, I would be like, why don't all these people that love me in different ways and have different flaws, why don't they do it together? But I feel like that'd also be chaotic. I don't know.
I trust Carly.
You kind of got dibs on my answer. So I think like first and foremost, absolutely not my family. And if I do die by suicide and you see my family members up there, please throw eggs or tomatoes or whatever at them. They would never be able to share my story in like anywhere near accurate. And I think that the people in my life who could provide a more accurate picture wouldn't, because I think they know that they wouldn't do me justice. They wouldn't be able to honor my experience, even if they tried. I was going to say that I think it would be great to have everybody share their perspective of like, this is the Carly I knew, and this is how I know that like she navigated her world. So some people would be able to, who I've like really let know about me, be able to know about the big feelings I feel and like how those manifest and how my brain works and stuff like that. And then there are other people who would be like, man, if you start getting her talking about like a few select authors, she doesn't shut up, which is actually for a lot of topics. One of those is Showgirls. Anyways, I think that when we have one person telling our story, we become so two-dimensional and it just loses so much because we are a completely different person with some overlap to everybody we encounter. So I don't think there's any one person who could fairly represent who I am as all the chaos monster that I am. I do think if my cat Bukowski were to tell my story, he would let the world know that I starved him every day, and my lap was too small and I overheated too often. So then he would never be able to get cuddles. So he just has a really hard life with me. And I think that would be his experience he would share.
Carly LARSON, chaotic monster, not hugging cats.
I hug him so much. He would be hugged. He would live on my lap 24/7 if I gave him the option, minus lunch breaks.
Okay, well, we don't have time for lunch breaks now. Let's get to question number 4. What should loss survivors do to make sure their loved one is remembered and how they wanted to be remembered? Once again, Nylah Burton.
Okay, so this one was kind of like a hard one. I feel like I feel like it's morbid to have this discussion with people, but I feel like if you have a loved one that you know is experiencing suicidal ideation, especially someone who's chronically suicidal, or like passively suicidal, like people who are like, are thinking about suicide, but like are not really going to act on it, but it's kind of a constant thought that they're having. If you have a loved one that you know is like that, I think that asking them questions about their experience, and not like blaming them or shaming them or anything like that, but just being like, if this were something to happen, I'm going to try to, help you get the support you need so that this doesn't happen. But if this were something to happen, like, how would you want me to respond? And I think that that's such a weird conversation for people to have. I've never had a loved one have that conversation with me. I wish that I think it would have made me feel better if they had, because I think it would have been recognizing that, to a lot of, in a lot of ways, I don't have control over whether or not I die by suicide. But, I think that it would, just like with other people, when they sit down and they talk about wills and they talk about things like that, I think asking them, how would you want me to talk about this? And I think that people are scared to have that conversation because they see suicide as this willful, rebellious, selfish choice. And so I think they don't want to validate the fact that it can happen, right? It's something that can happen. And so I feel like honestly having that discussion about what do we do if the worst happens? How do you want me to handle it? How do you want me to talk to people about it? Who do you, like Carly said, like, I don't want my family involved. Like, I need everyone to know that I don't want my mother involved at all in anything that has to do with me if something like that happened to me. So I think that that's a really good way, is having those discussions before something happens, especially if you know this person is struggling. And I know that's so hard for people to like wrap their brains around, but that's because of everything that we've been told about suicide, which is that, it's something that people should be able to stop. It's something that they should have the strength not to do, not something where it's like this person died by that. You know, that's why we worked so hard to change the language from committed suicide to died by suicide, right? And so when we reframe it like that, it does make it easier. We're not there yet, but it does make it easier to have these conversations with people. I also think that give yourself time to grieve before you try to tell the story. Give yourself time to really sit in that. You know, talk to people that you know are going to give you good advice, or maybe if they know they can't give you good advice, just listen. You know, seek therapy if you're able to and have access to it and you think that that's going to help you. Really give yourself time to go through the stages of grief. I feel like a lot of suicide loss survivors don't give themselves time to go through the stages of grief. They either, you know, they kind of jump. At least this is my feeling. I feel like they jump to rage, they jump to advocacy, right? They jump through these stages and they stay there for a really long time, actually. And I think that, you know, I'm not really sure why that is, but I have noticed that. That it seems to be a bit harder for them to go through the stages of grief. And so I think really making sure that they're going through those stages of grief. And, you know, and obviously knowing that it's not linear, you know, it's not like you're like, okay, done with anger, moving on, never going to come up again, but just letting yourself feel those feelings before you jump into trying to start a nonprofit. You know what I mean? I also feel like, you know, research can also be helpful. And again, that kind of goes back into giving yourself time. Like you're not going to search everything about suicide or a specific diagnosis right after something happens, but give yourself time to read up about it. Read up about statistics, read about, you know, like we said, psychiatric abolition, like read about these very hard to talk about concepts so you can have a better understanding of not only what your loved one was going through, but what other people are going through. Really sit and really like try to understand, you know, the research and the lived experience. Read memoirs about, you know, from mentally ill people or from people who have experienced this. And through that, maybe you'll be able to understand your loved one better and it will help you with the grieving process. And maybe it's something that you'll be able to tell their story better if that's what they want you to do and if that's what you feel is appropriate. I also feel like when remembering them, it's important not to do two things, which I think a lot of people do. I think a lot of people glorify them, right? Like you're like, they were like we talked about before. They were the best person ever. They never did anything wrong. They were a genius. They were smart at everything. They did everything perfect. They never said anything mean to me. They were an angel. Like all of these things that are really not helpful because you're not really telling the story right. You're kind of lying to yourself because no one's perfect. And I think that in the end, it doesn't really help you, one, tell that person's story accurately, and it doesn't help you to heal. But then the other side of that is I think a lot of people demonize it, right? So they're like, oh, they were always so troubled and everything with them was such a struggle. And every day they were in pain. And it's like, you know, try not to make them out to be this person who was something that they weren't. You know, maybe every day they were in pain, but I find a lot of suicide loss survivors just focus on what that person went through and, you know, the pain that they went through and don't really talk about like the fact that, you know, everyone contains multitudes and everyone's multi-layered and no one is one thing or the other. And so trying to avoid those extremes of portrayals and discussions about your loved one. And I think, you know, I think also a really important thing is respecting privacy. I feel like this might be like something different, but like one thing that always feels icky to me is like when people like, you know, go through diaries and publish people's diaries after suicide, like, and they're like, oh, this is what they wrote on, you know, November 13th, and this is how they were feeling. Like, I feel like that's an important part of considering it. Like, if you guys didn't have time to have that chat, like, think about, like, does this need to be put on Facebook? Does this need to be, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like privacy is a big thing as well. But I've seen a lot of people be like, oh, this is what this person like wrote and this is what they said like right before. And it's like, do you have to tell that? I don't know. Questions. So yeah, that was my
Carly?
So I think a really important thing is if you were not really active in somebody's life the last like chunk of it, I don't really think that you should be telling their story. And I think there's something to be said of like knowing people throughout their lives, and that doesn't diminish how important they were to you. But I have changed my personality and my life like every 3 years from the moment I was born. So like nobody knows the Carly that I am unless you've been in my life recently. So I see a lot of stories that are just, again, like focused on their accomplishments that were probably like young accomplishments. Like they're talking about somebody who's 30 who died by suicide. And they're like, well, in high school, this is who they were. And it's like, nobody cares about high school after you've graduated high school. And most of us spend a lot of time trying to forget those years. Please and thank you. So I think that's such a big portion is like, again, the people who are in their lives recently, I feel like a lot of the times they're not the ones talking as much. Just because I think they're there for more of the struggle. They kind of know the person a little more. And like we hide a lot of things from people we're close to. So this is not a blanket statement. I think like if you were not a big part of their life, this might not be the limelight for you. And that's okay. And there are people you can tell your story to. But I think we kind of, again, see this co-option where they're just like, all right, like I knew this person 10 years ago or 5 years ago, or I'm their mother, but we've been estranged, but I'm still going to tell that story because I'm the mom, and moms are supposed to tell their story. If you ever see my mother anywhere taking up space about me, like throw worse than eggs and tomatoes. But I think like I see so much of that where it's like, did you talk to your daughter or family member the last like 3 years? And like a lot of the times, I don't think it's there. So I think that's really important. If they're not going to be able to accurately presently or as like accurately as possible and presently represent you, then they shouldn't. That's not their story to tell, and that's okay. We don't always need to tell stories about these things. We live our lives with so many different stories we can adhere to. And then I think the other big thing that was said is like privacy. There's so much of my life that like I don't want people knowing about. There's a lot that I don't care, and there's a lot I'm pretty open about, especially in the spaces I take up. I think I see this most with like substance use stuff, where people who are concerned others like air their dirty laundry to no end. And it's like, so I get you think this is advocacy. And I think that you see yourself as a good person who could be like, even with all this, they were still somebody to love. Oh my gosh, we need to love people who use drugs. But it still is just like, I'm not sure if they really wanted the world. No, like that's not how they want to be remembered. They don't want to be just remembered for dying. They don't just want to be remembered for the substances they used in all of this. They were a multifaceted person, and you're choosing to make them the spokesperson for this experience that they never signed up for.
We've come to final thoughts, Carly.
Final thoughts. We need to listen to people with lived experience, and suicide attempt survivors should be first and foremost. I am not saying that there isn't a place for lost survivors, and I think they add a really powerful and profound perspective. Right now, they are the ones taking up the most space, and that needs to be subverted. That needs to change.
Anything else that needs to be subverted, changed, or abolished?
Everything needs to be abolished. Basically, the entire United States of America as it currently stands needs to just like flip over. Like in one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, At World's End, where they do the thing with the ship and the world flips over. I feel like that needs to happen to America right now.
Are you talking about Pirates of the Caribbean?
Yes.
Thank you, Carly. I appreciate you.
Also, I feed my cat all day, every day. He's a liar.
Final thoughts, Nylah?
Yeah. So just repeating what Carly said, which is that suicide survivors definitely need to be at the forefront of this. I think that there are absolutely spaces for suicide loss survivors because, as Carly said, that's powerful too. And that's an experience that we have to talk about as well. But again, I think that we need to rebalance it. We need to flip it over and bring it back to the place that it needs to go. Absolutely abolish prisons, abolish psychiatric hospitals, abolish. And I think in turn and in the spirit of abolishing, really we need to do better as communities. We need to have community responses, not these individualistic responses. We need to remember that suicide prevention starts before your friend starts texting you that they're feeling suicidal. It starts way before that. And it starts, with legislation. It starts, or, lack thereof, because we know that there are lots of really harmful legislations. I'm thinking about Kamala Harris's bill that we don't even have time to get into. But, it starts with, really just reimagining a different world. And one thing that I think is so important, and I cannot stress this enough, is we have to, particularly with caretakers, people who are caretakers, whether that's a healthy role for them or not, of people with mental illness or people who are experiencing suicidal ideation. I think that as a community, we absolutely have to support them better and, give them a lot more resources, because I think that the burden and the stress of doing that alone is part of what contributes to the rage and anger that we see when someone attempts or when someone dies. And so I think that we really have to get out of this individualistic mindset that we have as a country. Again, flip it over. And we really need to start thinking in terms of community responses, community structures that can help us to increase good mental health for everyone. And I think that we also have to stop expecting people to do it alone, whether that is caretakers, suicide loss survivors, suicide attempt survivors, the mentally ill or the mad. We have to stop leaving people alone and just being like, oh, take your medication, you'll be fine. Or take your loved one to the hospital, they'll be fine. We have to consider ways to work together, make everything more community-based and less about locking people up and giving them a little checklist about what to do, because we know that ain't working. So we need to try something else. So anyway, that was me.
I feel like we didn't rage enough. Like if anyone wants to pick something up and throw it against the wall, feel free to do that in the next minute or two.
Fuck state hospitals.
There we go. Anything else you want to promote? Give shout outs to how we can connect with you, support you?
No, just follow me on Instagram. I don't have Instagram followers, but I'm taking some really nice pictures lately, especially with my flower crown. So go ahead and do that because it's lonely over there.
Yes, we're going to get you new followers, Nylah. We have that power. So, and Carly can give you some tips as well. So that's going to do it for this week. Next week, it's our 1-year anniversary.
Yay!
Yes, we started, I guess, this third iteration of SPSM Chat a year ago, and my God, has time flew by, and my God, has the world gone to shit since then. So we got to go out on a high note. So that will be my last show as host of SPSM Chat. It's been a year. It's been fun. I hope that this brand moves on, that it survives, because it certainly has its place in the world still. But I don't know where I'll head to next. Of course, I'll still be live streaming. It's something that I'm very passionate about and something I believe in. And it's been amazing to see, of all the nastiness that's going on in the world, that I feel validated by how much live streaming is important now and how the value that people see in it now, whereas when I first started a few years ago, people thought it was a joke that I was wasting my time. So that's going to do it for this week. Thank you, Carly LARSON, for being my co-host. Thank you, Nylah Burton, for being our guest of honor. I appreciate you. I'm so glad. I know there's a lot going on right now. I'm glad we were able to connect. Like, I just happened to see one of your tweets and it's like, oh my God, I got to have this person on. And it happened. We made it work.
Yay. Thank you guys so much for having me. I had a lot of fun. I feel like we had a great conversation, and I did not know that this was your last day. So congrats / understanding that this is like a feely moment. But yeah, like that's cool to like go on a different journey. I love going on different journeys.
Thanks. Well, I mean, we're going to go out with a bang next Sunday, August 9th, 6 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Mountain Time, 8 p.m. Central Time, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have some old favorites. Marie's going to be back, Anxiety, so that'll be awesome as well. Be on the lookout for that. Of course, we'll make sure to push it on social media, and I hope a lot of you will join us. If you haven't been watching in a while, I hope you'll check us out one last time. But that's for another day. Thank you again, Nylah. I'm not going to put Carly on the spot again, so I'll let Nylah give us the closing line.
What do I say? I don't know. Fuck Donald Trump.